Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore the dyadic creative interface. With me is Dr. Vernon Neppe, who is author of a book called Reality Begins with Consciousness that he wrote with physicist Edward Close. This work has received the Whiting Memorial Award as an outstanding contribution to human science and culture. And we'll be discussing the relationship between these two individuals. Welcome again, Vernon.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
You and Dr. Close have created a work that many have described as breathtaking in terms of its scope. It touches on many different areas of science, philosophy, mathematics, and even spirituality.
That is true.
Mm-hmm. And has been acknowledged now through the Whiting Memorial Award offered by the International Society for Philosophical Enquiry.
Yes.
Which is quite a distinction.
Yes, we were awarded this prize unanimously for our research by the ISPE, which is the1000.com. And the component that was interesting was it is an interdisciplinary worldwide prize, but this was awarded unanimously, and it was unusual because we were both, so to say, at the highest level of ISPE diplomates. Mm-hmm. And so there had not been an award, because it's awarded worldwide to any individual, and there had not been an award from that organization for members of that organization for many years.
And as I understand it, this is an organization for people whose IQs or intelligence is measured at the level of maybe 1 in 1,000.
Yeah, that is the definition of that organization, mm-hmm. Yes.
And tell me, why did you join that organization?
Very strange. The last thing I would do would have been to join any exceptional IQ society. I had no interest in it. I had no interest in publicity in that regard. I had no interest in, so to say, boasting, and I wouldn't even list it. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to join that because I had an intuitive awareness that I needed to. And I did this because I had developed a model, which at that point in time I was calling vortex n-dimensionalism. Just prior to that, I was calling it vortex pluralism. Mm-hmm. And there had been some justified critiques of this, mainly, well, where the testable hypotheses, where does it fit really into science? And I was absolutely convinced. I was walking about convinced that vortices were ubiquitous in nature and were a major solution in terms of trying to solve mm-hmm. the world. And so I was looking for a partner.
Uh-huh. You were looking for a partner, and you felt intuitively that this organization might be a place to find such a person.
Oh, I certainly hoped so.
Mm-hmm. And parenthetically, vortices. Vortices, like a triangle, has vortices at each of the corners.
Yes, we like to look at it as something that involves rotational movement, that is dynamic, that is rotating, and this incidentally became a key part of the paradigm we eventually developed called TDVP, or Triadic Dimensional Distinction Vortical Paradigm. This is so fundamental, mm-hmm. and more we've realized that vortices are absolutely ubiquitous in nature and not only in our physical reality either. Mm-hmm. And we're always talking about rotation and movement, and in fact, virtually everything we've looked at is vortical.
So after you joined this society, I gather you encountered Dr. Close.
Yeah, he posted something and was interested in his book and mentioned Transcendental Physics, a wonderful book. And I contacted Dr. Close and I said, can I read it? And I sent him a copy of this Vortex N-Dimensionalism, which I knew had its own flaws.
And how long ago was that?
I am guessing this was early or sometime in mid-2008.
Over a decade ago.
Yeah, around about then.
A decade ago.
Yeah.
So you exchanged writings.
Yeah, and so I read his Transcendental Physics, and he read my Vortex N-Dimensionalism, and might have had a comment or two in relation to this, but no real acknowledgement. We never exchanged words. And I became intensely aware that he would understand the following. I sent him an email and I said, Ed, it's time. You know and I know that we've got to work together and this is how life's work. So let's begin. Now imagine you're sending an email to somebody you've never exchanged words with to say this kind of thing, but I knew that Ed would understand. And Ed replied and said, yes, you're right. Let's go.
Well, that's really quite amazing. I can tell you I do receive emails like that from individuals, and for the most part, they're wrong.
Well, we knew this was right.
Yeah.
And we knew this was, so to say, the song that we had come to sing. And so we began to sing the song.
Well, that is very interesting because it shows that right at the very beginning, there was an intuitive process that brought the two of you together.
Yeah, and we both knew it. And we've discussed it subsequently.
And you knew that he knew even before you'd really had any conversation.
We'd never had any conversation at that point.
How do you know that feeling of certainty came to you?
It came in a moment. And somehow it was a knowledge, an intuitive awareness. And we began working together and made a resolution that we would read some of our extra stuff and we would also meet generally by Skype or sometimes by phone. Ed is in Missouri, I'm in Seattle, and we would meet at a regular level, and it wasn't long before we made our first what I regard as major discovery. We called it the axiom of origin. And that discovery was that space, time, and consciousness are tethered together necessarily and always. And this might not sound like a big deal, but it was a very big deal because all the philosophies that we had encountered would either talk about, mass and energy and consciousness. If there's a consciousness, well, we're expressing it in terms of that, or vice versa. There's no such thing as mass and energy. Everything is just pure mind, or there's a link up between mind and matter. And there weren't people writing about space, time, and consciousness all being tethered together. That was our axiom of origin, and that's how we began.
Now, I might mention parenthetically that the Tibetan Lama Tarthan Tuku has a book called Time, Space, and Consciousness.
Yes, and of course, if you start reading some of these things, you discover that the only link-ups often are those involved with spirituality. But a lot of the spiritual link-ups, might be like the Berkeleyan kind of idealism whereby that mass and energy is contained within the spiritual.
Right.
Here we realized that these substrates were all together, they were meaningful, but the important thing was that they were in union They were tethered.
Tethered is a very interesting word. When I was a child, we played a game called tetherball, where the ball is attached to a rope, the rope is attached to a pole. How did you mean the term tether? I don't presume you had ropes in mind.
No, we did not, but it was one way to describe it.
Yeah.
It is really in union. You know, Hermann Minkowski, the great mathematical physicist in the early 20th century, in his special lecture to an Academy of Medicine and Physical Sciences in 1908, stood up and said, no longer is there such a thing as space alone and time alone. Henceforth, there will always be the union of the two.
Mm-hmm.
And then, wasn't so much longer. A little more than 100 years later, we effectively were busy saying, no longer is there just space and time, and people for 100 years spoke about space-time. Based on the scientific data that one has, space, time, and consciousness will henceforth always be in union.
Now, did you develop a mathematical model at that time?
At that time, we did not. This is what was so intriguing.
Mm-hmm.
In our first edition of Reality Begins with Consciousness, there's very little mathematics. We started working with it. Early on, however, that was something that was in our mind. I remember when Ed Close and I first met. And that was, strangely enough, in Amsterdam. I was traveling to South Africa, and Ed was returning from the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And it just so happens he was flying through Amsterdam. Real coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
And Ed had a few hours available in terms of his connection flight and came to visit me at the Hilton Hotel in Amsterdam, our first meeting. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is as Ed was going back to catch his plane, he said, those vortices, you know, we can explain this using Fermat's last theorem. And that was the beginning of our mathematical adventure in terms of this.
I see. And he, as I understand it, could be thought of as a specialist in Fermat's last theorem.
Indeed, he is. And in fact, some people get upset when one mentions this, but he wrote a book called the Book of Atma. And in an appendix to the Book of Atma, which means the Book of the Soul, in a little appendix, there is the solution to Fermat's last theorem. And you'll remember that this became the biggest question in mathematics for 350 years.
It was unsolved.
And it was unsolved.
If I recall, Fermat was a mathematician who lived in I guess it would have been the 17th or 16th or 18th.
In the 1600s, yes.
1600s, the 17th century. And in one of his notebooks in the margins, he wrote a solution to a technical problem in mathematics, but never explained how he arrived at the solution.
That's true. And Ed Close solved this 25 years before in 1969, December 1969.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere along the line it was never recognized. But Ed is a great mathematician.
Mm-hmm. And so you began developing mathematical strategies or models or formulas to go along with this idea of space, time, and consciousness all being unified.
Yeah, and more than that, we started discovering all sorts of things. I had developed a philosophical model called unified monism,
mm-hmm.
where obviously it was monistic, and everything was a unit, was unified, a single component in terms of all of reality. Mm-hmm. And a lot of philosophies can be expressed within this unified monism. And thought this was original, and this derived to some degree later on from our scientific model. Mm-hmm. It was a direct mathematical and scientific derivation.
Yeah.
And Ed one day says, oh, I found a copy of a book I wrote, and he's never really had published it. He just had a few copies, and he fished it out, and it was called Infinite Continuity.
Mm.
I might as well have written it. It was the same kinds of ideas, the same kinds of concepts. So this is where we found these similarities. He had his transcendental physics. The problem with transcendental physics was it worked, but it didn't quite work. And I had my vortex end dimensionalism. And I suddenly, when we came together, we put together these, and it became our model, which we ultimately called TDVP.
It's as if you are like two pieces of a puzzle that just fit together.
Exactly that. I drew up, so to say, at that point, 39 criteria for what a theory of everything should be. Mm-hmm. And I hated that term, theory of everything. Yeah. And we use the term meta-paradigm, because theory of everything in physics implies based on particular physical and quantum phenomena, and we weren't at that stage yet. Mm-hmm. And my model scored 29 out of 39, my vortex end dimensionalism, and Ed scored 23 out of 39. Mm-hmm. Just to put into perspective, the standard model of physics scored 13 out of 39, and when we analyzed 24 other models, or 24 models, the highest score besides Ed and myself was 19 out of 39. Mm-hmm. And we had a discussion on Kabbalic mysticism, and Kabbalic mysticism scores that 19 out of 39. And a great collaborator of ours who has read virtually all our stuff, Dr. Adrian Klein in Israel, his model scored 19 out of 39. Just gives a little bit of a perspective. Yeah. In any event, when this came together, we were at 39 out of 39. We found that the holes that we had solved were put together. It was a little bit of mathematics, but there was a lot of translation into physical experience. Mm-hmm. And we were already hypothesizing that besides infinity and higher dimensions, that the likelihood of the higher dimensions was that it was a 9-dimensional model. And of course, within it came consciousness. And those three components, higher dimensions, 9-dimensional finite model, infinity, and consciousness became a core, because we realized that you were actually linking up the finite with the infinite. They weren't separate. That in our life, we were all experiencing this whole single component. But it took till 2013 for us to realize that this 9-dimensional model, which we were convinced existed, could be demonstrated mathematically. And that is a fascinating story.
So that's 5 years of creative collaboration.
Right there.
From 2008 to 2013, you're coming up with a very grand metaphysical, cosmological scheme with a mathematical, philosophical basis. It must have been very exciting for the two of you.
It was very exciting, but this is how it began. Mm-hmm. On one of the internet groups, I mentioned something about our TDVP model. Mm-hmm. It was about maybe 2 years before this. And an astronomer from Johns Hopkins wrote and said, when you guys can demonstrate why the Cabebo mixing angle is the size it is, then I'll believe you that you have a model. Mm-hmm. Well, for 50 years...
You took that up as a challenge.
Right. For 50 years, people had been trying to solve the size of the Cabebo mixing angle. Why was this stupid angle in physics 13.04 degrees? Nobody could make sense of it.
And gather that you were able to apply your model somehow to that problem.
Yeah, and that was Ed's work initially. It's interesting. We wrote a paper, 50 discoveries, or really discoveries that have changed, that have been groundbreaking, that have changed our models of reality. And with respect, at that point there were 50. At this stage, I'd say there are 52. And it was rather interesting because I started looking at this and saying, now, who was the major person who was doing this or that or the other? Well, I could answer that there was never a major person because we were always interfacing and we always had, in a way, the same idea. But if I had to look at that intuitive insight, that intuitive awareness, it's virtually equal. It was 25.5 me, 24.5 Ed, and now there's 2 more, and I think we 1 and 1 there, or maybe even, we're pretty even.
Now, let me ask you this. The astronomer who challenged you, obviously you submitted your proof to him. How has he responded?
Yeah, we posted it. Never heard another word from him. This is really most intriguing.
Yeah.
It's like, wait a minute, they've solved it. And like it doesn't exist. And then, of course, we replicated the 9-dimensional model. So it's a 9-dimensional, finite, vortical spinning model. And we found that we could apply it not only to this Cabibbo mixing angle, to such strange things as the disappearing electron cloud, and to intrinsic electron spin. Don't worry about too much about these terms, but there were 4 or 5 different areas that we could apply it to.
Well, I would think at that point you would want to find a professional journal in astronomy or physics to publish this derivation of the Cabibbo angle.
Yes, and we published it in great detail, and there were several different publications there, but not in professional journals of physics. And here's the reason why. We have found that our, let's call them discoveries, have been at such a rapid pace that we might find new things every week. In fact, we found a new thing just before I came out here to Albuquerque to talk to you. And the problem with our conventional scientific journal model, and I'm editor of 2 journals, and Ed is a science editor of another. We know these things, and therefore we, I suppose, have access in terms of publishing these things, and rather quickly. The problem is that by the time these conventional physical journals are publishing, the stuff is out of date. It's not wrong. We found that we've been able to jump in. Once we looked at this 9-dimensional model, we were able to develop a mathematical model. And then each step graded. But we are now in the process, the major process, of writing a string of books for the layperson. And I'm hoping that scientists will grab hold of these, and also at the same time submitting several of these different articles to very much mainstream journals, because we know it's going to take time.
For example, the Cabibbo angle derivation, you came up with that 5 years ago in 2013 or so.
Yeah.
So has it changed? Is it out of date as of?
No, nobody's been able to refute not virtually, any of our
So
work.
it's not out of date.
Yeah. And so we're putting this all together, and we're about to submit these things, and then it gets submitted somewhere else. And it's a gradual phenomenon. Over this period of time, I have over 700 publications. I'm going to guess at least 200 or 300, I haven't totaled them up, are publications between Neppe and Close, or Close and Neppe, depending on who got the first idea. And that have all come out. And it's crazy when you start saying, you say to yourself, wait a minute, I should be submitting it here or there or the other. But, it's a strange phenomenon, and I only realized it a few months ago. I was talking to a scientist, and, I have my academic positions. I was recruited by the University of Washington to establish the first division of neuropsychiatry in a department of psychiatry in the US. It was an international search after they couldn't find anyone nationally. Mm-hmm. Of course, this accent you hear is not American, it's South African. But be that as it may, and I discovered that the object in conventional academia is to get grants, is to get funding. Mm-hmm. You spend months and months writing grants, and I sometimes joke that Ed and I don't spend any months writing grants, we just do. And this has led to a problem because we've not had a penny of funding, and it's cost us tens of thousands of dollars in terms of time, effort, and working with others, employing others in terms of doing these things. Your question is a legitimate one, and I'm moving now in the direction of trying to get all of this spread out, a whole string of books. Mm-hmm. We've battled with the title. Should we call it Solved? Should we call it Answers? And then I kept saying, wait a minute, there's a book here, a book there. And as you know, we've done a whole string of different YouTubes, for example. And so far, there are about 14 different books I want to write off.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very interesting that after collaborating now for an entire decade, you both seem to be on the same page, because very often creative partnerships fall apart over a period of time. I mean, the Beatles didn't last 10 years.
Yeah. But then we aren't as good as the Beatles singing.
Well, you may be better at what you do.
Right. This creative partnership, it's rather like we're the same mind in another kind of way. Yeah. I'll give you an example. I'm at an international conference, and I'm busy saying to a group of people, we're talking, we all sitting there, and I'm saying, what's amazing is Ed and I have the same ideas, invariably. And sometimes we'll come up with the same idea at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I look at them and I say, but here's an idea where we differ. I maintain that the photon in the infinite reality contains an infinite amount of Gimel. And Gimel, of course, is this massless, energyless third substance or third process that we've discovered that might be consciousness that is in union with everything.
It's one of the many discoveries that you and Ed have come up with together.
Yeah, and it's a major one because our universe, our cosmos could not be unified without Gimel. Mm-hmm. And we were always intrigued in terms of the photon. And of course, there's the photoelectric effect that was originally described by Einstein. And there are link-ups with electrons. And Ed would say, well, the amount of Gimel in a photon must be the same as the amount of Gimel in an electron. Mm. And I was busy thinking, the amount of Gimel in an electron, yes, would be the same as a photon in the finite reality, but in the infinite reality, it's infinite. So I'm busy telling these people, this is where we differ. First time I found this. Now, we've already, by that stage, stayed together for 8 years. And Ed comes walking along the corridor, and he arrives, and before he sits down, he says to me, Vernon, I've been thinking that the amount of Gimel in a photon in the infinite reality must be infinite. And that is the kind of example that goes on. We'll come along and I will speak to him. I'll get so excited. The component pertaining to dark matter and dark energy, we've discussed this.
Yes, we've done a separate interview on this.
Where there is this link with Gimel or maybe consciousness. Mm-hmm. And I picked up the phone and I was really excited because of this linkage, that suddenly we had discovered something new. And this was all part of an epiphany. It has to be. And sometimes Ed has these epiphanies. But then when we pick up the phone and we speak to each other, we discover that we were both thinking the same thing at the same time, particularly with these large discoveries. Imagine we're dealing with a 9-dimensional finite reality embedded in the infinite. Imagine we're dealing with a third process that is necessary in terms of stability at the atom level all the way through to the cosmos, to dark matter and dark energy. These are rather remarkable findings. Imagine you can calculate out and refute that the materialistic basis of the atom has to be wrong. And these are the kinds of discoveries that go on. And we say, now, where does it come from? And don't think it comes from us. It's not. So in other words, I can't say, well, we discovered this or we discovered that. It's this awareness, this insight that I think comes from an extracerebral and outside the brain reality. Mm-hmm. It comes from an awareness that it has to be. And I don't know whether or not it is others working with us.
Yeah.
In our dreams, in our sleep, in our reality, whether we are getting into the extra consciousness, awareness, and we're hitting that meaning, and what we're doing is trying to translate it.
I mean, some people might say you are part of the same soul group, or that you have a telepathic connection with each other, or there are many different ways to express it. I think you've probably expressed it more eloquently just now than that.
Maybe in that regard, and it is remarkable. And sometimes when I'm ill, I haven't spoken to Ed for a few days. I've not been feeling well. I'll phone Ed and Ed says, you know, Vernon, I've really not been well. And so we will even link up in terms of this.
It's a kind of biological resonance.
There is a certain resonance there, as certain Dr. Mishlove knows, synchronistic resonance between us, and a certain awareness that we've got to do this, to the extent that we knew that when we started talking about reality begins with consciousness, we knew we were talking about consciousness being that primacy component of it all, and that it's only reality beginning in that finite context, because it goes on and on infinitely at that infinite level. But those components of 9-dimensional linkage, of Gimel, of vortices that are rotating through, and that's where the Gimel comes in, of the link up with cosmological reality, of the refutation of atomic materialism. These are areas that we weren't able to work with on our own. When you look at the first edition of Reality Begins with Consciousness, and it went through 6 editions, we didn't call the one an edition, but over a period of a very, very short period of time. Each time we were modifying it. And there was going to be another one. And we eventually said, look, let's start publishing all these things. Let me just make one more point. Very important.
Okay.
Even though we were publishing these in journals that were not the highest level journals, every single one of our papers have been through peer review and considerable peer review, because I'm absolutely insistent on it. And we've been able to particularly thank, in a way, 2 of our scientific colleagues, Dr. David Stewart, who Ed has known since his college years, and who has a remarkably similar career, and whose PhD involved hundreds of mathematical equations, and he could understand these things. And Dr. Adrian Klein in Tel Aviv, Israel. And those 2 people have read virtually every single one of our papers.
I see. So it's not just exclusively this dyadic creative interface. It's also a community of support.
It is a community of support, but it's our ideas. And Dr. Klein's model, incidentally, scored 19 out of 39 on those 39 criteria, which have now extended. I haven't even bothered to examine all the others, but to 62 criteria. And we are now 62 out of 62. You see, if you're dealing with a so-called meta-paradigm or perfect theory of everything, you have to be perfect. You can't say, well, this is where it does not fit. And people would say, well, what about gravitation? What about the fundamental laws of physics? This is what we're working with at the moment. And we think we have solutions in that regard. So it's really been very, very exciting.
Well, the interesting thing about a paradigm, as I understand it, according to Thomas Kuhn, is that it operates at the subconscious level. People don't consciously say, we're going to change the paradigm. They usually, it happens gradually, as they say, sometimes one death at a time, funeral by funeral, science changes.
Yeah, that was Planck's famous statement.
Yeah. So it may well be generations, and people will just grow up naturally thinking the way you are and Edward Close have developed your thoughts.
And this has been a little bit of a regret. Science does advance in terms of major scientific advances, funeral by funeral. And we've, in fact, one of the papers we've written about are the 11 stages. So we've extended Thomas Kuhn in terms of the 11 stages of scientific revolutions. But it does happen very, very slowly. And even though we're saying it's not for us, and we've realized it's beyond us in a way, and these awarenesses and insights, it is a frustrating source of regret that with the advent of the internet, the progression has been so slow. We still would love to see it, I keep getting this from major physicists, major biologists. Oh, Vernon, yeah, we know you're right, but it's going to take 100 years. And somebody says, no, maybe it'll even take 50 years. And Ed and I make the joke, well, maybe we'll come back as a reincarnation, see how our work has progressed over time. And we don't know. But, there are historical markers there. Poor Tesla, never was recognized in his time. George Cantor, the great mathematician, submitted a paper in the 1880s, and the journal editor wrote back and said, we're not ready for this, please resubmit in 100 years' time. And I keep saying to myself, I don't want to be like these guys. And it's not the ego component. It is the component of, we realize this is the song we've come to sing in this wonderful world, and people have got to start understanding this, because you can apply things like strange things. We were talking about multidimensional time, and you can apply it to space travel even. Space travel not only across space, but maybe across time. And people are spending billions of dollars in terms of still 3S1T physicalistic ideas. And the more creative ideas one gets, we've generated, right at the start, 600 different hypotheses. And we've been able to demonstrate life elements. And we've been able to demonstrate why the periodic table of the elements is how they are and why they're not. And we've been able to demonstrate how there are triads in things like the quarks. And so it's really, really exciting. And it's a great, great adventure. And we wish we could get tens of people doing PhDs in our work, because we've just touched the surface. But it's been a very, very exciting touching of the surface. But you know what the most frustrating part is? You'll send it to colleagues who you respect, and you'll get no response. It'll be like, I don't know. And Ed and I have a joke about it. The joke is, if we use this word mathematics, this absolutely frightens away everyone. Sometimes we use the word math, and about half will stay. It's not as frustrating. But everything we've now been doing is not only based on empirical knowledge and testable, and This is what my vortex end dimensionalism was not. And to some degree, transcendental physics missed some major components. Everything is testable, and everything is based now virtually on mathematical proof. So people can't argue it. And people now cannot even argue that this is not realistic, because we've been able to correlate our Gimel and what we call triadic rotational units of equivalence. We've been able to correlate this with the data from the Large Hadron
Well, maybe
Collider.
you've been subjected to the curse of Cassandra.
Well, I don't want that curse. The days of the internet are upon us, and let people listen. And, I wouldn't mind if some billionaire listening to this recording thinks, well, maybe if Doctors Neppe and Close have never been funded, maybe we ought to fund them. And then Doctors Neppe and Close, in our late years, will be able to do even better research with some funding.
Let us hope. And let us hope with the billionaires out there, they give a tiny little portion to help support our video as well. That would be nice.
Would be wonderful. Just 100 million or so.
Well, Dr. Vernon Neppe, I'm really happy to be able to share this story with our viewers and to hear it from you, because I think it will take time for people to digest what you've done. But the human side of it and the passion that you and Ed have put into this work, I think, is very inspirational. And I'm grateful for you to spend this time with me.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for being with us.